Today we will be discussing peptic ulcer disease. It is also known as acid peptic disease. Now, what is peptic ulcer? It is localized loss of mucosa in stomach or duodenum. So peptic ulcer can be either a gastric ulcer or a duodenal ulcer. The commonest sites are first part of duodenum and pyloric antrum. Now let's discuss relevant anatomy and physiology. So that will give us the clarity why peptic ulcer disease happens. So what are the different types of cells in stomach? So the first type of cell is parietal cell, which is also known as oxyntic cell. It secretes HCl, hydrochloric acid, and intrinsic factor. The second type of cell is chief cell. It secretes pepsinogen and gastric lipase. The third type of cell is mucus cells, which secrete mucus. The fourth type of cell is enteroendocrine cell. Now they can be of two types: G cells, which produce gastrin and are located in pyloric antrum, or D cells, which produce somatostatin. The last type of cell is enterochromaffin-like cells. Which are also known as ECL. They produce histamine. Apart from these, there can also be some stem cells in stomach. So these are the different types of cells: parietal or oxyntic cell, which produce HCl and intrinsic factor; chief cell, which produce pepsinogen. The HCl secreted by parietal cells convert pepsinogen to pepsin. Chief cells also produce gastric lipase, which helps in digestion of fats in stomach. Then there are mucus cells, which produce mucus. Enteroendocrine cells, G cells and D cells. G cells produce gastrin, D cells somatostatin. Enterochromaffin-like cells, which produce histamine. Apart from them, there are some stem cells. Now, what are the factors responsible for acid production? So acid production, three main substances are responsible for secretion of H plus from H plus K plus ATPase pump. So three main substances are responsible for acid production. One is histamine, which is produced from enterochromaffin-like cells. Second is gastrin, which is produced from G cells in pyloric antrum. Third is acetylcholine, which is produced from postganglionic vagal efferents. So these are the three substances. Now acid productions occurs from parietal cells. Parietal cells have a H plus K plus ATPase pump which secretes H plus into the lumen and potassium is taken back. Now these cells have three receptors. One is H2 receptors for histamine. So this is enterochromaffin like cells which produces histamine, which acts on this H2 receptor. H2 receptor is a GS type of receptor. So when it is stimulated, there is stimulation of adenyl cyclase enzyme which is responsible for production of cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP activates protein kinases, and these protein kinases stimulate H plus K plus ATPase pump. The second is gastrin, which is produced from G cell. Produce gastrin. Now gastrin acts on G receptor, or it is also known as CCKB receptor. Now this G receptor is a GQ type of receptor, and when it is stimulated, there is stimulation of inositol 3-phosphate DAG diacyl glycerol pathway, and there is increase in calcium, and this calcium activates protein kinases which stimulates H plus K plus ATPase pump. The last is acetylcholine, which acts on M3 receptor. Now this M3 is also a GQ type of receptor which acts through inositol triphosphate diacyl glycerol pathway and increases calcium. And thus there is activation of protein kinases which stimulate H plus K plus ATPase pump. Okay. So H2 receptor is of GS type which acts through cyclic AMP. Gastrin receptor and M3 receptor are GQ type which increase calcium. And ultimately all these pathways activate protein kinases, and there is a stimulation of H plus K plus ATPase pump. Now gastrin also stimulates histamine. Gastrin also stimulates enterochromaffin like cells and production of histamine via G receptors. Similarly, acetylcholine also stimulates enterochromaffin like cells via M3 receptor, and it causes release of histamine. On the other hand, D cell produce a hormone called somatostatin. This somatostatin has an inhibitory effect on both gastrin as well as enterochromaffin like cell. So it inhibits them both. Now let's suppose this is a parietal cell. So this is the H plus K plus ATPase pump. So how this secretion of HCl happens? Chloride is secreted via a pump, which is an energy dependent pump, and when chloride is secreted, potassium is also secreted out into the lumen to maintain electroneutrality, and this is an energy dependent pump. This is the lumen. Now this potassium is exchanged back via H plus K plus ATPase pump. Potassium is taken into the parietal cell, while H plus is secreted out. Now this parietal cells also has carbonic anhydrase enzyme. So H2O plus CO2, water and carbon dioxide combine to form H2CO3, and this H2CO3 splits into H plus and HCO3 minus. This H plus is the source of H plus for H plus K plus ATPase pump. This H plus is thrown out by H plus K plus ATPase pump into the lumen. The enzyme responsible for production of H plus and HCO3 minus is carbonic anhydrase. This HCO3 minus is secreted into the lumen in exchange with chloride, and this HCO3 minus is responsible for protecting the gastric mucosa along with mucus. So this bicarbonate ions act as a protective factor for the gastric mucosa. So why peptic ulcer disease happens? It happens when there is imbalance between aggressive and defensive factors. So what are the aggressive factors that we know about? Aggressive factors are acid, pepsin, NSAID, H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori, and reduced blood flow. So in acidic environment of stomach, pepsinogen is converted into pepsin, which is responsible for production of ulcers. How NSAIDs produce? NSAIDs inhibit COX enzymes, cyclooxygenase enzyme, which are responsible for production of prostaglandins. And these prostaglandins act as a protective factor. So once COX is inhibited, these prostaglandins reduce, which is responsible for ulcer. Now what are the defensive factors? Defensive factors are mucus, bicarbonate ions, blood flow to the mucosa, and the process of restitution. That is, if any minor abrasions or erosions happen, there is process of repair through which new cells are formed over there. So these are the defensive factors. Now what are the drugs that we can use for treatment of peptic ulcer disease? So the first category of drugs is drugs that reduce acid production, and these are anticholinergics, H2 blockers, proton pump inhibitors, Now the second category of drugs are antacids, which are acid neutralizing agents,